12 years of silence. 12 years of skin that felt like an open wound. In the cold, neon-lit corridors of the underworld, Seo Hun-woo was a god, untouchable, unreachable, and unmerciful. They called him the Porcelain King, not because he was fragile, but because the mere brush of a sleeve against his wrist could cause a neural seizure that would level a room. He had survived bullets, blades, and fire, but he couldn't survive a handshake. To the syndicate, he was a monster. To Vanessa Williams, he was just a man drowning in a sea of invisible noise. Vanessa didn't come to the mountain estate to change a king. She came to pay her bills and keep her head down. But when the lights went out and the first shots rang out, Vanessa didn't see a mafia boss. She saw someone about to fall into the abyss. She did the unthinkable. She reached out, her warm, calloused fingers locking firmly around his bare wrist. The world didn't end. The searing white heat didn't come. For the first time in 4,380 days, the screaming in Hun-woo's nerves stopped. In the pitch black of a hallway under siege, the most dangerous man in Asia finally breathed. This is the story of a man who owned everything but could feel nothing, and the woman who reached through the glass to pull him back to life. The mountain estate was less of a home and more of a mausoleum for the living, a structure of obsidian glass and polished chrome that seemed to swallow the light of the New York wilderness. Vanessa followed the head housekeeper, Mrs. O, through hallways so silent she could hear the frantic rhythm of her own pulse. The air inside was pressurized and filtered, carrying the faint, clinical scent of ozone and expensive cedar. Rule 1, Mrs. O whispered, her voice like dry parchment. You do not speak unless he addresses you. Rule 2, you do not linger in any room he occupies. And Rule 3, the only rule that matters if you wish to see tomorrow, you never, under any circumstances, touch him. Not his hand, not his sleeve, not even the air he breathes if you can help it. Vanessa clutched the hem of her charcoal grey apron, her dark skin a stark contrast to the sterile white marble of the servants' corridor. He's a man, isn't he? Not a ghost. Mrs. O stopped dead, her eyes widening in warning. In this house, he is the gravity that keeps the floor beneath your feet. Remember that. They reached the grand atrium just as the heavy oak doors swung open. A phalanx of men in razor-sharp suits filed in, their faces carved from granite, but it was the man in the center who froze the breath in Vanessa's lungs. Seo Hun-woo moved with a predatory grace, draped in a charcoal overcoat that seemed to absorb the room's warmth. Even in the height of spring, he wore black leather gloves, his hands clasped behind his back as if to seal himself away from the world. He didn't look at the staff lined up like porcelain dolls. He didn't even blink when one of his captains, a man twice Vanessa's size, accidentally stumbled half an inch into his path. The air in the room curdled. Hun-woo stopped, his profile as sharp and cold as a jagged shard of ice. He didn't shout. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply turned his head, a slow, mechanical movement that felt like a death sentence. Space, Hun-woo murmured, the word vibrating with a low, dangerous frequency, is the only thing I require of you, Minute. Do not let your incompetence crowd me again. The captain turned a sickly shade of grey, bowing so low his forehead nearly hit the floor, his entire body trembling. Vanessa watched, mesmerized and horrified. She had seen tough men in the Bronx, but she had never seen power that acted like a physical vacuum, sucking the life out of everyone nearby. As Hun-woo crested the grand staircase, his gaze drifted momentarily toward the new staff. For a split second, his dark, hollow eyes met hers. There was no soul there, only a vast, aching silence that made her skin crawl. He was a king in a cage of his own making, and as the heavy doors of his study slammed shut, Vanessa realized she wasn't just a maid. She was a ghost tending to a god who had forgotten how to be human. The storm that had been brewing over the Catskills finally broke, lashing the obsidian glass of the estate with a violence that felt personal. Vanessa was in the library, polishing a silver tea service she knew would never be used, when the world simply vanished. The constant hum of the high-tech fortress died in an instant, replaced by a silence so heavy it made her ears ring. Then, the backup red emergency lights flickered to life, casting long, bloody shadows across the rows of leather-bound books. A series of muffled thuds echoed from the floor below, the unmistakable sound of suppressed gunfire. Panic surged, cold and sharp, but Vanessa's Brooklyn-honed instincts kicked in. She knew the layout of the second floor better than the security teams did. She dropped the silver cloth and moved toward the master study. She found him there, a dark silhouette against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Hunwoo wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was doubled over, his gloved hands clutching his head as if he were trying to keep his skull from splitting open. The sudden failure of the estate's sophisticated noise-cancelling frequencies had left his nervous system raw, exposed to the raw electrical static of the lightning outside. "Mr. Seo," she hissed, rushing toward him. "Stay back," he gasped, his voice a jagged wreck of its usual composure. "The air, it's too loud." A heavy crash sounded at the study door. The wood splintered as a flashbang grenade rolled into the room. Vanessa didn't think. She didn't remember the warnings or the no-touch policy that had been drilled into her soul. As the device detonated in a blinding white strobe, she saw Hunwoo begin to collapse, his eyes rolling back as the sensory overload threatened to shut down his heart. She lunged forward, catching him before his head hit the marble desk. In the chaos of the smoke and the approaching footsteps of the assassins, Vanessa's bare hand shot out, locking firmly around his wrist, her skin meeting his for the first time. The effect was instantaneous. Hunwoo didn't scream. He didn't convulse. Instead, his entire body went rigid, then suddenly, impossibly, he went limp in her arms. The frantic, erratic heaving of his chest smoothed into a deep, shuddering breath. For Hunwoo, the world of jagged glass and searing heat had vanished. Where Vanessa's fingers pressed against his pulse, a wave of cool, rhythmic silence washed through his brain, grounding the electrical storm that had tortured him for 12 years. He opened his eyes, looking up at her through the haze. For the first time, the porcelain king looked human, vulnerable and utterly stunned. The assassins burst through the door, their red laser sights dancing across the walls, but Hunwoo didn't look at them. He only looked at Vanessa's hand, gripped tight against his skin, realizing that the woman he was supposed to fear was the only thing keeping him from the abyss. He stood up, still anchored by her touch, and reached for the hidden sidearm beneath the desk. The silence wasn't just peace, it was power. The aftermath of the siege left the estate in a state of clinical repair, but the atmosphere had shifted from cold to suffocating. Vanessa expected to be fired, or worse, erased for her transgression. Instead, she found herself summoned to the master suite, a place no staff member entered while the king was present. Hunwoo stood by the window, his back to her, his leather gloves discarded on a mahogany side table like shed skin. "You broke the first law of this house," he said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. He didn't turn around, but Vanessa could see his reflection in the dark glass. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the distant, storm-lashed trees. "In the syndicate, we call that a death sentence. You reached through the barrier I spent a decade building." Vanessa stood her ground, her chin tilted up. "I saved your life. If I hadn't touched you, Those men would have finished what the seizure started. And yet, Han-woo turned, moving toward her with a speed that made her heart hammer against her ribs. He stopped exactly 2 inches from her, his presence an overwhelming wall of heat and expensive spice. "You have left me with a problem, Vanessa. The noise is back. The screaming in my nerves has returned tenfold because now they know what silence feels like." He reached out, his bare hand hovering near her cheek. He didn't touch her, not yet, but the air between them seemed to crackle with static. "Your punishment is this. You no longer belong to the cleaning staff. You are my shadow. You will eat when I eat, sleep in the dressing room adjacent to mine, and stand within arm's reach at every meeting, every dinner, and every sleepless night." It was a gilded cage, a 24/7 tether that bound her to the most dangerous man in the city. Over the following days, the shadow protocol became a silent ritual of addiction. During grueling conference calls with ruthless lieutenants, Han-woo would find his vision blurring from the mirror pane of a subordinate's violent story. He would simply reach back, and Vanessa would place her hand on his shoulder. The grounding effect was instantaneous. The syndicate members watched in bafflement as their boss, usually a man of jagged edges and sudden violence, became a calm, lethal predator. At night, the addiction grew deeper. He didn't want sex, he wanted the miracle of a quiet mind. He would sit in his armchair in the darkness, and Vanessa would sit at his feet, her hand resting on his knee. She watched the tension bleed out of his shoulders as he finally drifted into a shallow sleep. He was the king of the underworld, but in the flickering firelight, Vanessa realized he was a man starving for the very thing he had spent 12 years forbidding. She was his living cure, and as his fingers subconsciously brushed against hers in his sleep, she realized that the punishment was a trap for both of them. He couldn't let her go, and she was beginning to forget why she wanted to leave. The fire in the library had burned down to a heap of glowing embers, casting the room in a bruised purple light. Vanessa sat on the floor, her back against the velvet sofa where Han-woo lay staring at the ceiling. Her hand was resting on his forearm, a steady anchor that kept the phantom screams in his nerves at bay. For hours, they had sat in a silence so thick it felt like water, until Han-woo's voice cracked the stillness. "It was called the White Room," he whispered, the words sounding like they were being dragged over broken glass. "My father had passed, and the syndicate was a crown without a head. Jin-soo, my own brother, didn't want to fight for it. He wanted to ensure I couldn't hold it." Vanessa felt a tremor ripple through his muscle, but she didn't pull away. She pressed her palm firmer against his skin. "They used high-frequency sound waves and strobe lights," he continued, his eyes unfocused as he drifted back 12 years. "A sensory assault that never stopped. They kept me in a room where every surface was a reflective white, then they applied electrical currents to my skin. Not enough to kill, but enough to rewrite my brain's software. They forced me to watch videos of people being touched, being hurt, while the shocks synchronized with the images." He let out a jagged breath that was almost a sob. "By the time they pulled me out, my mind had fused the concepts of sight and touch. My brother's gift was to make the world a weapon against me. To see someone brush their hair was to feel a blade on my scalp. To see a handshake was to feel my bones being crushed. He turned my empathy into a localized hell." Vanessa looked at him, and for the first time, the porcelain king vanished. In his place was a boy who had been systematically dismantled by the one person he was supposed to trust. The ruthless executions, the sterile glass walls, the terrifying isolation, it wasn't a display of power. It was a suit of armor worn by a man who was constantly being flayed alive by the mere act of existing. "You aren't a monster, Hun Woo," she said softly, turning to look him in the eyes. Her thumb traced a small, comforting circle over his pulse point. A monster wouldn't have survived that. A monster wouldn't care about the noise. Han Woo turned his head toward her, his dark eyes searching hers. The coldness was gone, replaced by a raw, aching wonder. For 12 years, he had been a ghost haunted by his own skin, but in the warmth of Vanessa's touch, he finally saw a version of himself that was allowed to heal. He didn't pull away. Instead, he closed his eyes and leaned into her hand, a survivor finally finding a place to rest. The stillness of the estate was shattered by the rhythmic thumping of rotor blades as a sleek, black helicopter descended onto the private pad. Jin-soo stepped out, looking every bit the refined predator in a charcoal suit that mirrored his brother's. Yet his smile was a jagged thing that never reached his eyes. He walked into the grand hall as if he already owned the air, his gaze immediately snagging on Vanessa, who stood precisely 2 inches behind Han Woo's right shoulder. "Brother," Jin-soo drawled, his voice a mocking silk. "You look rested. I heard the mountain air was doing wonders for your condition, but I didn't realize you'd taken up collecting such exotic company." Han Woo's jaw tightened, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. The presence of his brother was like a low-level hum of static in his brain, a precursor to the storm. "You didn't fly from Seoul to discuss my domestic staff, Jin-soo. State your business." Jin-soo chuckled, reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket. "Always so cold. I came to offer a peace treaty. Our father's associates are restless, and they worry about your health. I thought a gift might bridge the gap." He produced a small, velvet-lined box and flipped it open. Inside sat a heavy platinum cuff link set, encrusted with rare black diamonds that seemed to vibrate under the foyer's recessed lighting. "A masterwork of engineering," Jin-soo said, stepping closer than the security protocols allowed. "The stones are cut to resonate at a specific frequency. They say it can stabilize the nervous system." As Jin-soo moved the box closer, a high-pitched whine, inaudible to anyone else, began to drill into Han Woo's skull. It was the White Room all over again, a concentrated burst of sonic interference designed to shatter his focus. Han Woo felt the familiar white-hot spikes of pain beginning to flare behind his eyes, his knees threatening to buckle under the weight of the invisible assault. Beside him, Vanessa saw the subtle tremor in his hands. Without a word, she stepped forward under the guise of inspecting the gift, her forearm subtly brushing against Han Woo's elbow. The contact was like a lightning rod hitting the earth. The screaming in Han Woo's nerves didn't vanish, but it became manageable, anchored by the cool reality of her skin. Han Woo stared directly into his brother's eyes, his expression a mask of impenetrable stone. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. "It's a gaudy toy, Jin-soo. But I'll keep it as a reminder of your generosity." The smile on Jin-soo's face faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his features. He looked from his brother to the maid, his eyes narrowing as he sensed the invisible shield between them. The wolf had come to test the fence, and though he hadn't found a breach, he had certainly caught a scent. He bowed mockingly, the diamonds in the box continuing to hum their lethal, silent song. "I'm glad you like it. I have a feeling we'll be seeing much more of each other very soon." The atmosphere within the estate grew thick with a new kind of silence, one that felt less like peace and more like the breath held before a slaughter. Jin-soo moved through the corridors like a ghost in the machine, his presence a constant, low-level irritation to the house's equilibrium. He waited until the early hours of the morning, when the moon was a silver sliver over the mountains, to execute the pivot of his betrayal. With the clinical precision of a surgeon, he bypassed the security sensors of the servants' wing and slipped into Vanessa's small, tidy room. In the bottom of her wooden trunk, beneath a hand-knitted sweater from her mother and a stack of letters from the Bronx, he tucked the diamond-encrusted cufflinks he had gifted to his brother. But he added a second piece, a compact, military-grade signal booster. When paired, these devices didn't just vibrate, they acted as a beacon, projecting a localized field of neurodisruption. To anyone looking, it would appear that Vanessa had been systematically radiating Han Wu's private quarters with the very frequencies that triggered his agony. By dawn, the trap was sprung. Jin-soo didn't go to his brother. He went to the syndicate's internal security chief. He staged a routine sweeps of the estate, claiming he had detected an unauthorized transmission coming from the servants' quarters. When the security team stormed Vanessa's room and unearthed the platinum jewels, the room went ice cold. "Explain this," Jin-soo demanded, his voice echoing in the grand hall as he held the jewelry aloft for the security cameras. "My brother brings a stranger into his inner sanctum, a woman with no pedigree and no loyalty, and we find her in possession of a high-frequency transmitter designed to paralyze him. This isn't just theft, it's an assassination attempt funded by the rival Guriong family." Vanessa was dragged into the hall, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. She looked toward the grand staircase, hoping to see Han Wu, but he stood at the top, his face a frozen mask of stone. Jin-soo leaned in close to her, his smile a serrated edge. "Did you think he actually loved you, little maid? To him, you were just a medical supply. And now, you're just a traitor." The evidence was damning. The frequency logs showed the device had been active every night Vanessa sat with the boss. The narrative was perfect. She had been grounding him with one hand while slowly frying his nervous system with the other, keeping him dependent and weak. For the first time since the blackout, Han Wu didn't move toward her. He stood in the shadows of the upper landing, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, watching as the woman who had given him silence was branded as the architect of his loudest pain. The shadow protocol had been inverted, and the only path left for a mafia boss betrayed was a path paved in blood. The judgment hall of the Jiangmi syndicate felt like a tomb, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and impending death. The council elders sat in high-backed chairs, their faces obscured by the dim lighting, while Jin-soo stood to the side, his expression a triumph of feigned sorrow. In the center of the room, Vanessa was forced to her knees, her hands bound. She looked up at Han Wu, searching for the man who had shared his nightmares with her, but she found only the Shadow King, cold, unreachable, and lethal. "The law of the syndicate is absolute," Han Wu's voice rang out, echoing off the stone walls. It was a flat, dead sound. "Betrayal by a member of the inner circle is answered only with blood. Jin-soo has provided the proof. I will not have my weakness exploited by a common thief." He drew his signature silver-plated handgun. The movement was fluid, practiced, and terrifying. Vanessa saw his finger tighten on the trigger, and for a fleeting second, she saw a microscopic flicker in his eyes, not of hatred, but of a desperate, silent command, "Trust me." The gunshot was deafening. The muzzle flash illuminated the room in a violent burst of white. Vanessa felt a sharp sting against her shoulder as a pre-planted blood pack burst, spraying dark crimson across the white marble floor. She collapsed instantly, her body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The council members watched, satisfied, as two of Han Wu's most loyal cleaners, men who had been briefed in the dark of night, stepped forward to haul her corpse away in a heavy black shroud. Jin Su stepped forward, reaching out to touch Han Wu's shoulder in a show of brotherly solidarity. Han Wu flinched back, his eyes burning with a renewed, artificial rage. "Do not touch me," he hissed. "Get out. All of you. I want her scent scrubbed from this house by morning." As the hall cleared, the true operation began. Under the cover of the cleansing, Vanessa was moved not to a shallow grave, but through a series of pressurized airlocks located beneath the master suite. This was the bunker, a self-sustaining sanctuary built into the bedrock of the mountain, shielded against every frequency known to man. When the heavy blast door sealed, Vanessa sat up, gasping for air as she wiped the stage blood from her skin. The door opened minutes later, and Han Wu stepped in. He didn't speak. He simply fell to his knees in front of her and pulled her into his arms, his forehead resting against hers. He was trembling. To the world, he was the ruthless executioner who had killed his only comfort. But here, in the absolute silence of the earth, he was just a man holding on to the only person who made the world quiet. "You're dead to them now," he whispered into her hair. "Which means you're finally safe enough for me to finish this." The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sea of velvet masks and whispered conspiracies, a place where the elite of the underworld gathered to crown a new king. Jin Su stood on the mezzanine, his chest swelling with the premature pride of a victor. He watched as the heavy doors at the far end of the hall swung open, revealing Han Wu. For the first time in memory, the Shadow King was without his gloves. He walked into the room with his hands exposed, a move the council interpreted as a sign of supreme confidence, but which Jin Su knew was a desperate bluff. "Look at him," Jin Su whispered to the council elder beside him, walking into his own wake. Han Wu reached the center of the dance floor, the eyes of 100 masked predators fixed on him. Jin Su didn't wait. He reached into his pocket and depressed the trigger on a device no larger than a car key. Hidden behind the silk draperies of the ballroom, a series of high-output transducers hummed to life. They began to pulse at a frequency that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly against the nerves. The world turned into a kaleidoscope of agony for Han Wu. Every flash of a camera was a needle in his eye. Every rustle of a gown was a sandpaper rasp against his brain. His vision began to tunnel, and his knees wavered. The syndicate members leaned in, sensing the collapse of their titan. Jin Su began his descent down the grand staircase, ready to declare his brother unfit. But then, a figure emerged from the crowd. She wore a gown of midnight lace and a gold filigree mask that hid everything but her steady, dark eyes. To the onlookers, she was just another guest, but to Han Wu, she was the only anchor in a storm of glass. She didn't hesitate. She stepped into the center of the floor and slid her hand into his, her fingers interlacing with his bare palm. The pain didn't stop, but it lost its teeth. The frequency was still there, a dull roar in the background, but the grounding heat of Vanessa's skin acted as a shield, a neural bypass that allowed Han Wu to breathe. He stood tall, his grip tightening on her hand as he looked up at his brother. "Is that all you have, Jin Su?" Han Wu's voice echoed through the ballroom, projected with a terrifying, calm clarity that cut through the sonic hum. He began to walk. With Vanessa at his side, her hand a permanent lock against his, he moved toward the staircase. Every step was a defiance of the physics that should have leveled him. Jin Su's face drained of color as he frantically mashed the trigger, but Han Wu didn't flinch. He ascended the stairs, a man walking through a fire that could no longer burn him. When he reached the top, he stood a head taller than his brother, the girl from Brooklyn holding the king steady as he prepared to deliver the final blow to the wolf. The silence that followed the gala was not the jagged, hollow void of Han Wu's past, but a heavy, purposeful stillness. The Syndicate Council had moved with terrifying efficiency once the evidence of Jin Su's treachery was laid bare. There was no room for mercy in their world, only the cold mathematics of survival. Jin Su was stripped of his name, his assets, and his pride, transported under heavy guard to a remote, soundproofed compound in the mountains of South Korea. He would live out his days in a luxury cage, surrounded by the very silence he had tried to weaponize against his brother, a prisoner of the isolation he had crafted for another. Back at the upstate estate, the glass walls no longer felt like a fortress or a cage. The clinical ozone scent had been replaced by the fragrance of blooming jasmine and the honest, earthy smell of the coming rain. The shadow protocol was officially over, replaced by a new reality that the Syndicate was still struggling to comprehend. Han Wu stood on the wide obsidian balcony, the morning sun cresting over the ridgeline and painting the world in shades of liquid gold. He wore a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up, his scarred forearms exposed to the open air. For the first time in 12 years, he wasn't bracing for an assault. He wasn't scanning the horizon for the next wave of pain. He was just breathing. Vanessa stepped out from the shadows of the master suite, her presence a warm hum in the space beside him. She didn't hesitate, and she didn't wait for permission. She reached out and laced her fingers with his. Their joined hands rested on the stone railing, bare skin against bare skin, bathed in the unapologetic light of day. Han Wu looked down at their hands, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The synesthesia was still there, a faint, melodic vibration in the back of his mind, but it was no longer a scream. It was a song, harmonizing with the steady beat of Vanessa's heart. "The elders are asking about the new direction of the Syndicate," Vanessa said softly, her thumb tracing the line of his knuckles. "They're afraid you've gone soft." Han Wu turned to her, his dark eyes reflecting the dawn. He squeezed her hand, a firm, grounding pressure that felt more like power than any weapon he had ever held. "Let them wonder. They'll find out soon enough that a man who can feel everything is far more dangerous than a man who feels nothing." He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her and tucking his face into the crook of her neck. There were no gloves, no barriers, and no more fear of the noise. In the heart of his empire, the Shadow King had finally shed his old skin, discovering that the greatest strength wasn't found in being untouchable, but in finally being held.